Okay. Actually, this is a simple definition of mediator. Okay. When we have an independent variable and a dependent variable, but the effect of independent variable to dependent variable is not only direct effect, and part of this effect go to dependent variable through another variable. In other words, mediating variable transfer or transmits the effect of IV to DV. Actually, when we apply mediator, we want to understand the mechanism of effect. So we want to understand if we say IV has a positive effect, for example, on DV, what's the mechanism of this effect, right? Okay, this is a very good example from Hare book to understand the mechanism of this effect and to understand the meaning of mediator. For example, we hypothesize this relationship, and we know based on literature and based on some previous study that increasing seawater temperature, right, will increase number of incidents. So increasing seawater temperature will increase number of incidents. Sometimes maybe we don't understand the meaning of this, why seawater temperature should influence on number of incidents, right? But if we introduce another variable between these two, number of swimmers, so this helps us to understand why seawater temperature has positive effect on number of incidents, or increasing seawater and temperature will increase number of incidents. This mediation variable is number of swimmers, right? So when we put this variable between IV and DV, we can say increasing seawater temperature will increase number of swimmers, because the warmer the water, the more swimmers. And increasing the number of swimmers will increase number of incidents. So the more swimmers, the more incidents. So now we can understand the mechanism of effect of seawater temperature on number of incidents. So this is the role of mediator. So when we apply mediator, when we put mediator in our framework, it means the effect of IV on DV is transferred through another variable. It's transferred through mediator. So the effect of IV first is transferred to mediator, and then mediator can transfer this effect to DV. This is one of the papers that we published recently in 2020. This paper published in Journal of Travel Research, right? In this paper, we assess mediating role of resident perception toward tourism development, something that now you are working in your group presentation, right? This is the framework that we actually apply for this study and assess the mediation role of resident perception between these 5 antecedents and support for tourism. The meaning of resident perception, mediating role of resident perception here is, okay, when we say resident perception mediate this relationship, means, for example, community attachment. The effect of community attachment on support. First, increase perception of people, and increasing perception of people will increase support. So based on this, we can say effect of community attachment on support go through perception. So when community attachment increase, it means the perception of people will increase. And when perception, positive perception of people increase, it means their support for tourism will increase. Right? So this is the meaning of mediator. So when we say mediator, we introduce a variable that this variable is able to transfer effect of IV to D. Sometimes it's good to compare with direct effect. So, and we see, okay, if community attachment increase, this increasing of community attachment will increase support through direct effect or through other variable or through resident perception, right? So this is the meaning of mediator. Many studies in different disciplines have applied mediator. For example, here is one example from 454 empirical articles in this journal, Psychological Science Journal. And, but this study is in 2004, a paper published in 2011 and 2012. Among 450 plus papers, more than 15% of these papers used mediator. So you can see only in one single journal in 2 years, you can see more than 15% of papers have applied mediator, have used mediator. You can see this one in different disciplines. You can see marketing, business, management, tourism, and hospitality, education. You can see in different disciplines that mediator in quantitative research has a very critical role. So we need to understand mediator, and we need to know how, if we have mediator, how we can hypothesize mediator hypothesis, how we can hypothesize mediation relationship, and how we can assess it, right? This is actually the mathematical presentation of mediator. If we do, when we don't have mediator, X effect on Y. So Y is right. Y is CX, right? Plus error. When we don't have mediator. But when we put mediator between X and Y, this Y dependent variable now will be supreme X, right? Will be supreme X plus this relationship BM and error term, and M is AX. So Y is supreme X plus B, and M is AX plus error. So y is C prime plus AB x plus error, right? So y is C prime plus ABX plus error. If we compare with this equation, C will be now C prime plus AB, right? So this one, C prime plus AB equals C. So C equals C prime plus AB. We call this C as a total effect, C prime direct effect, and AB, that is very important term for assessment of mediator, is indirect effect. So here we have C is C prime plus AB. This term is indirect effect, right? So this indirect effect transferred through M, and this C prime is direct effect. So we assess significance of this AB, or indirect effect, for assessment of mediator. You remember when we have only direct relationship, we assess significance of path coefficient or beta coefficient to see the effect of X on Y is whether it's significant or not. Or when we hypothesize effect of X on Y in multiple regression, for example, or in PLS, we assess this relationship and see this relationship is significant or not. This path coefficient or beta coefficient is significant or not. And then based on this, we can say our hypothesis can be supported or not. For mediation, we have this hypothesis, indirect effect. And this hypothesis, we need to assess AB term, significance of AB, significance of this indirect effect for mediator. This is simple mediator, when we have only one mediator. Sometimes we have more than one mediator. So we have multiple mediation. For example, here we have two mediator, MW. So effect of X to Y transferred through C prime, A1, B1 through M, A2, B2 through W. Or here we have a very complex mediation. So X to Y, we have C prime, we have this one, we have this relationship, and we have this relationship. So we have three indirect effects and one direct effect. And all these effects are from X to Y. So in this case, we have multiple mediation. We have many approaches for assessment of mediator, but before going to assessment of mediator, I need to explain a hypothesis development for mediation. Here, for example, you have M between X and Y, right? This is a very common question. When we have mediator, how should we support mediator? Because for direct effect, we discussed that direct effect, we need support from theory and from previous studies, right? When we have effect of X to Y, when we have effect of X to Y, so this relationship, what's the hypothesis? Okay, for example, H1 is X has a positive effect on Y, right? On Y. So X has positive effect on Y. So this is hypothesis. We have to support this hypothesis by theory and previous studies. But what about mediator? What we need to support from previous studies? Do we have to find the exactly mediation hypothesis in previous studies or in theory? That most of time is not possible. We cannot find the exactly mediation relationship from theory. So how can we support and how can we justify mediation hypothesis? For mediation hypothesis, we need support from theory for this relationship. I'm just talking about hypothesizing mediation. I'm not talking about assessment. I'm not talking about assessment. For hypothesis development of mediator, okay, we need to identify, we need to find some support in the literature that X has effect on Y. So you need to support this effect by theory. And also you need to support and justify effect of X on M and M on Y based on literature and previous study. So if you find support for these three relationships, you can hypothesize mediation role of M between X and Y. For example, if you support X to M based on, okay, if you look at on this paper, in this paper we apply two theories, social exchange theory and Weber theory of rationality. So when we want to hypothesize mediation role of resident perception, we support relationship between community attachment and support based on Weber theory, right? Or based on social exchange theory. And then we support effect of community attachment on resident perception based on Weber theory and resident perception on support based on social exchange theory. So when we support this relationship, then we hypothesize mediation. It doesn't mean that we need to hypothesize all relationship. Hypothesizing relationship, writing hypothesis, developing hypothesis is based on your objective. If you want to assess relationship between community attachment and resident perception, this one, okay, so you can hypothesize this relationship. If you want to assess this one, you can hypothesize. If you want to assess direct relationship, you can hypothesize. But for hypothesis development of mediator, these are not compulsory. These hypotheses are not compulsory. Only you need to justify these effects. Why? Because when you say resident perception mediate relationship between CA and support, it means actually you say the logic for this one is community attachment should have effect on support. because you want to investigate indirect effect. So you need to support this effect directly or indirectly. So you need to support this relationship based on literature and based on theory. Also, when you say this variable mediate this relationship, okay, it means you need to support community attachment has effect on resident perception, and resident perception has effect on support. So based on these three logics, not hypotheses, based on these three logics and these three reasons, you can say, okay, resident perception mediates community attachment and support. So you can hypothesize mediation. So you can write hypothesis, mediator hypothesis, right? How we can hypothesize a mediator when we don't have exactly this mediator in the literature. Okay, if we don't have exactly mediator in the literature, and so we don't have exact theory to support mediation, when we don't have, we can justify in this way. We can justify based on three steps. First, you have to justify relationship or effect of IV on DV based on literature and based on theory. What's the logic for this one? Okay, when you say resident perception mediate relationship, it means you say community attachment has indirect effect on support, right? So when you say indirect effect on support, there is a meaning hidden in this statement. What's the hidden meaning? Is community attachment has effect on support. This is the meaning that hide in this statement, right? When you say community attachment has indirect effect on support, means in the reality, community attachment should have effect on support. So you need to justify this effect based on theory. Don't need to hypothesize. This is three steps that you can follow when you don't have exact mediation in the literature. First step is to justify relationship between IV and DV based on theory. So this relationship is possible to support based on theory. For example, based on theory of planned behavior, you say this is logical, and you can support and you can justify community attachment has effect on support, right? This is first step. Second step, when you say resident perception mediates community attachment and support, it means, again, there is a meaning behind this statement. When you say this mediate between CA and support, it means community attachment should have effect on resident perception. This is the meaning behind this statement. So you need to justify this relationship based on theory. Again, I don't talk about this hypothesis. For example, direct relationship, community attachment and support. You might not have this relationship and this hypothesis in your study. But logically, you have to justify this relationship and you need to find support from theory for first step. Second step, IV to mediator, community attachment to resident perception, and first step, resident perception to support. If you have these three steps, if you have theoretical support for these three steps, you can hypothesize mediator.
Excuse me,
Later I will discuss the way for assessment of mediator. Now I don't talk about assessment of mediator. Statistical assessment of mediator is another story. We have something similar to these three steps in assessment of mediator. We call these steps Baron and Kenny. Baron and Kenny method for assessment of mediator is not acceptable anymore. So we should not use Baron and Kenny for assessment of mediator. So now I'm only talking about hypothesis development. If you don't have exactly mediator in previous study, how can we hypothesize? Is it clear? Or still not?
Excuse me, Mustafa.
Okay.
What is that? Can I understand it like this? The mediator variable does not have to be an established variable, because we don't have we don't know the items to.
Again, you talk about measurement model. I'm here talking about a structural model and a structural relationship. We assume that we already established construct. We already supported all construct and items to measure each construct and definition of each construct. Right? We need to do before going to a structural model. You have to explain how you measure resident perception. What's the meaning of resident perception? How, based on what item you measure resident perception, you need to explain first. And then when you go to a structural model level, a structural for hypothesis development, now you talk about effect of community attachment on resident perception to support, mediation role of community attachment and support. So you talk about a structural model. You already settle measurement theory and measurement model. Right?
Yes.
So you have to have measurement theory for mediator and for IV and for DV. Then you can hypothesize relationship. Okay? So is it clear hypothesis development for mediator? This is a very common question when we want to hypothesize mediator and we don't have in previous study. Because actually if you have in previous study, most of time there is no any contribution. Okay, this paper we published 2020 in Journal of Travel Research based on new impact factor that yesterday was released. The impact factor of this journal is 7+, 7 point something, Journal of Travel Research. And we have 1,000 papers that publish about resident perception, publish about factor influencing on resident perception and factor influencing on support. How we were able to publish this paper. How? Based on justification of mediator. Because previous study, we could not find any study that discussed mediation role of resident perception between these antecedent and support. So this is, we built our justification based on this. So we don't have in previous study how we hypothesize if we don't have these steps for hypothesis development for mediator if we don't have this hypothesis in previous studies. If you have, okay, it's very simple. You can follow previous studies and hypothesize mediator. If you have theoretical support and empirical support. For example, we have a theory, recent year, this theory is popular, it's become popular theory. This theory is attitude, sorry, this theory is value, attitude, behavior. So this theory is VAB theory. Okay, if you apply this theory, is very simple to justify attitude, mediate relationship between value and behavior. Okay, if you have something like this to support your mediation, or you have some previous study that justify mediation of one variable, so it's easy to justify. These 3 steps is for situation that you don't have mediation in previous study and you want to justify as a first person in your research. If you want to justify, these 3 steps can be very good to justify theoretically and based on empirical studies. First, justify effect of IV on DV, effect of IV on M, and effect of M on DV. Each one based on literature and based on theory. So if you justify these 3 steps, you can hypothesize mediator. Right? Okay.
Dr. Mustafa, can you please repeat the three steps you said just now? If you don't mind, please.
Okay. These 3 steps. Effect of IV on DV. Effect of IV on DV. Community attachment on support. You don't need to hypothesize. Just you need to provide the support from theory and the empirical study for this effect. Effect of IV on M and M on DV. These 3 steps are very similar to Baron and Kinney steps. So Baron and Kinney steps is for assessment of mediator, not for hypothesis development. So I believe Baron and Kinney steps for hypothesis development still is valid. But for statistical assessment of mediator is not valid. Do you understand? Okay. So this is for hypothesis development. For assessment of mediator, there are many different tests There are many different approaches to assess mediator statistically. McKinnon 2002 categorized 14 tests, 14 different tests under 3 categories. First category is causal steps category. In causal steps category, that Baron and Kenny is very popular method for belong to this group. Baron and Kenny approach is very, very famous and popular method for assessment of mediator. In this group, actually we assess a few steps. For example, we assess, now I'm talking about assessment. Please carefully, listen very, very carefully this part. There are many misunderstandings for this part and hypothesis development. In this group of assessment methods, or in Baron and Kenny, is the most well-known method under this category, we assess effect of IV on DV and see the effect of IV and DV before including mediator should be significant. So now we are talking about significance of effect. For Baron and Kenny, effect of IV on DV should be significant before including mediator. Then effect of IV on M should be significant. So the direct effect between before including mediator should be significant, IV and DV. Effect of X on M and M to Y should be significant. So this is second step, now talking about significance. So we need to apply test to check effect of IV on DV before inclusion of mediator, first. Second, after inclusion of mediator, X to M should be significant, M to Y should be significant. This is second step. And third step, relationship between IV and DV, direct effect, after including mediator should be less than this effect before inclusion. So if we go to this one, based on Baron and Kenny, we have to assess significance of this C, and this C should be significant. Then we include mediator. This A should be significant. This B should be significant. Second step. And third step, C prime should be lower than C. C prime should be lower than C. Either be insignificant or at least lower than C. So this is 3 steps for Baron and Kenny method, Baron and Kenny approach for assessment of mediator. And Baron and Kenny belong to first group, but Baron and Kenny is outdated and dead approach for assessment of mediator. So if you apply this approach for assessment of mediator for your paper or your thesis, is not acceptable anymore. Your paper will be rejected and your thesis will be criticized by examiner. So don't use this approach. But this approach was very, very common approach until recent years. And still some study, we can see some study that apply this approach. But many reviewers and the examiners reject this approach and don't accept this approach, right? Another group, we assess C minus C prime. This is second group of tests. And the third group that now is acceptable method for assessment of mediator is assessment of significance of product of coefficient or indirect effect, AB. This term called product of coefficient. This term called product of coefficient, this term. So based on recent literature, third group is assessment of significance of indirect effect, AB, product of coefficient. But actually under, for assessment of product of coefficient or indirect effect, we have many different tests. You can find the delta test groups, percentile and bias corrected bootstrap confidence interval, distribution of the product, and some tests under third group, under this group. So under this group also we have different tests. One of the famous tests under this group, still under this group, is Sobel test. In Sobel test, we actually assess significance of AB. We assess significance of AB based on this Sobel test. So here we have a standard error of this term. So we calculate T value for this term, AB, product of coefficient. And based on this, we can assess significance of AB. So Sobel test is one test under third group. Baron and Kenny is one test and approach under first group. But addition to Sobel test belongs to this delta method. Addition to Sobel test, we have another test, Orion test, Goodman test, but all belong to this delta method. Okay? Okay, this is study by Hayes and Schwarzkopf in 2013. They did some simulation studies for different tests and concluded that Baron and Kenny test, first group, and under third group, some tests like Sobel test, Orion test, and Goodman test. Sobel test an example of this delta method. All of these tests are low power tests. And so also in third category, if you apply Sobel test is least powerful and least trustworthy test and method for assessment of indirect effect. So again, Sobel test and this group of tests also are not acceptable. And they have very low power for assessment of indirect effect. Right? So far, this study reject this one. Also reject this one. And under third group, reject. Under third group, reject. delta method, right? Reject Sobel test and this test. So they are least powerful and trustworthy for assessment of indirect effect or product of coefficient. Some some researcher tried to combine, for example, Sobel test from third group and Barron and Kenny. And based on these two, try to increase the power of analysis. But actually, by combining two bad things, you cannot create a good things. By combining two low power tests, you cannot create a strong power test. Right? So don't use Barron and Kenny, don't use Sobel test for assessment of mediator. So what we need to do, what we should do, this is the best test for assessment of mediator. So for assessment of mediator, you have to apply third group. You means you need to assess significance of indirect effect or product of coefficient using percentile or bias corrected bootstrap confidence interval. So you have to calculate confidence interval for assessment of indirect effect, product of coefficient, and based on result of bootstrapping, either bias corrected or percentile, you can assess indirect effect and mediator. If indirect effect is significant based on one of these two tests, if it's significant, you can conclude that mediator is significant mediator between IV and DV. So for assessment of mediator, you don't need to assess direct effect. You don't need to assess X to M. You don't need to assess M to Y. Again, you don't need to assess and you don't need to have direct effect in your framework. Only you have to assess AB, right? Significance of AB. You have to assess significance of AB term. This one. Not this A and B separately. So you need to assess significance of supreme. You don't need to assess significance of supreme. You don't need to assess significance of C, A, and B. Only you need to assess this term, indirect effect. And this indirect effect should be significant. The method to assess significance of indirect effect is a percentile and bias corrected confidence interval, bootstrapping confidence interval. So these two methods are best for assessment of mediator. Product of coefficient, indirect effect, and significance of indirect effect using these two methods. These two methods are most trustworthy tests for mediator assessment. Okay? It's clear? This diagram is from Zhao, and actually this diagram is very helpful diagram for us understanding and assessment of mediator. If you look at this diagram, you can see here we check AB, significance of AB. If AB is not significant, means we don't have mediator. But if AB is significant, we have different choices. If we have supreme in our model, if we don't have supreme, if we don't have direct effect, okay, never mind. Only interpret AB. But if you have supreme in your framework, if you have supreme in your framework, so this is X, this is Y, and M, so A, B. So you need to assess AB, okay? If AB is significant and you don't have direct relationship, okay, just interpret AB. But if you have also this relationship, you hypothesize this relationship and you have this relationship in your framework, so you can compare AB and supreme. If the sign of, so if the sign of AB and supreme sign are same, means AB and supreme both are positive. So we say these two are indirect effect and direct effect, or mediator and direct effect, or complementary. So this mediator is complementary. So mediator complements direct effect. But if the sign of A, B, and supreme are opposite, one is positive and one is negative, so mediation is competitive. So mediation and direct is competitive, right? So this is good to understand the type of mediator. When we apply product of coefficient using bootstrapping, we don't talk about partial and full mediation. Maybe you heard about partial and full mediation. Partial and full mediation is for Baron and Kenny approach. So when you use product of coefficient that you have to use, so we don't talk about full and partial mediation. But you can, based on ZAO, you can, if you have supreme, you can discuss complementary or competitive nature of mediator. These two papers are good. This is a very good paper written by Nitzel and his colleague. I actually put this paper in your folder. So you have this paper in your folder, reading list. This is good paper to understand mediator. And this is our recent paper about mediation. So also this paper is good to understand the concept of mediator, how we can hypothesize and how we can assess mediation.
Yeah.
Okay. This is the model that we, before we discuss and create it. So also this is model for your group presentation, first group presentation, right? Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. Now I want to add mediator here. I want to add the resident perception as a mediator between these four antecedent and support. Right? Okay. To make a model a bit simpler, just I hide all indicators. To hide indicator in SmartPLS, you know, we need to right click and hide all indicators of all constructs. If you click on this one, all indicators will be hidden. Okay, so now you have this framework. Okay. Want to add the mediator. So we want to add another variable here. Click on select. And this variable is resident perceptions. Okay. We need to assign some items to resident perception. Just I put assign items of positive perception, right? So this variable is positive perception. So drag and drop variable on this positive perception. Change the name also in positive residence perception. Okay. And again, hide indicators. Okay. But we need to connect this variable. To connect variable, we need to click on connect. And from the beginning to end, and also resident perception to support. And this variable. Also, I delete direct relationship because I assume I don't hypothesize direct relationship in my framework. So I want to delete it. To delete, we need to right click in each arrow and delete. And this one, delete. This one, delete. And this one, delete. So only for my framework, only I hypothesize mediation role of resident perception between community attachment, environmental attitude, economic gain, and involvement and support. So here, I don't have any direct relationship, and I don't need, because based on my objective, I don't want to hypothesize. All right? Okay. So I created the model and want to assess this mediation hypothesis. We need to click similar to assessment of measurement model and structural model. Click on PLS algorithm. So when you click on PLS algorithm, you have all information here. You have assessed measurement model first, based on loading and based on construct reliability and discriminant validity, right? This is not part of the mediation assessment. You see my screen, right? You see a SmartPLS software.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay. So you have the result here. For assessment of mediator, you need to look at indirect effect. You already assessed measurement model, and now you want to assess your hypothesis, and your hypotheses are only mediation hypothesis. For mediation hypothesis, you need to look at indirect effect. Okay, if you click on indirect effect, okay, community attachment and attachment to support means community attachment positive perception and support, right? So this is first indirect effect. Second one, economic gain, positive perception, and support. So community attachment, positive perception and support is 0.109. So this is indirect effect. So this is AB. For economic gain, 0.075. So AB for this one is 0.075. So this is AB. Third one, environmental attitude, positive perception and support, 0.110. And the last one, involvement, right? For involvement is 0.202. So you have these four indirect effects. You have these four indirect effects. Community attachment. So this one, AB, 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 and AB. So you have here four indirect effects, right? But based on PLS algorithm, you don't have significance of these indirect effects. Here only you have the value of this indirect effect, right? To get the significance of indirect effect using percentile or bias corrected bootstrapping, you have to run bootstrapping. If you click on bootstrapping, okay, here you can see different options: percentile, bias corrected bootstrapping, standardized bootstrapping. So you can choose one of them. Best one is bias corrected bootstrapping. So click on this one, and the sample should be 5,000. But now I just put 500 to do faster, because if I put 5,000 sample, take line to calculate significance. One tail and two tail depend on your hypothesis. If you hypothesize one tail, or you need to select one tail. If you hypothesize two tail, you need to select two tail. For example, if you hypothesize indirect effect of community attachment on support, for example, say community attachment has positive indirect effect on support through perception, so it's one tail. But if you said perception mediates relationship between attachment, community attachment and support, it's two tail. So based on your hypothesis, you can choose one tail or two tail. Let's choose two tail. And start calculation. Okay. Now here you have two different options: total indirect effect and specific indirect effect. You need to click on specific indirect effect. And for a specific indirect effect, you can see this direct effect: community attachment, effect on positive perception, effect on support. Okay, this is the value. And here you can see the p-value and t-value, but we don't need p-value and t-value. We want bias corrected confidence interval, right? We want this one, bias corrected confidence interval. Okay, so this is the first indirect effect, the second one, third one, and fourth one. This is the value. How we can interpret? You remember interpretation of confidence interval for multiple regression. So interpretation here is exactly same. If between lower level and upper level of confidence interval, if this range includes 0, okay? If 0 falls between lower level and upper level of confidence interval, it means the relationship or effect or mediator is not significant. if 0 is between this. If this range doesn't include 0, 0 doesn't fall between lower level and upper level of confidence interval, you can conclude this indirect effect is significant or mediator is significant. So for first one, lower level is 0.011, 0.021. Second one, and upper level 0.218. So 0 is not between. Second one, 0 is not between. Third one, 0 is not. And fourth one, 0 doesn't fall between these two values. So it means positive resident perception mediate relationship between all these IV and DV. So all these indirect effects, community attachment, resident perception support, environmental attitude, resident perception support, economic gain, resident perception support, and involvement, resident perception support, all these four indirect effect or mediation hypotheses are significant. So this is the way that we assess mediation. Here we don't have any direct effect and we don't need to assess direct effect. Even if A and B, one of A and B is not significant, but indirect effect is significant, still is acceptable. We only look at indirect effect, right? So this is the way that we create the mediator in SmartPLS, and we assess mediator using confidence interval bias corrected bootstrap, right? If we change, for example, this framework to another framework, and we now for second framework, we connect direct effect, because for second framework, we also hypothesize direct effect. So we need this one based on these direct hypotheses, not for mediator. So we can connect this direct hypothesis and again run bootstrapping, okay? And now, again, we need to go to a specific indirect effect and confidence interval bias corrected. So here you can see the values are changed. The values of indirect effect have changed because we have direct effect. But still, these indirect effects are significant because 0 doesn't fall between lower and upper level of any of these confidence intervals. So even when we have direct effect, we don't look at direct effect for interpretation of significance of mediation. Only we look at indirect effect. And based on indirect effect, we interpret, we assess mediator. Right?